Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into one of Britain's most bizarre and, frankly, notorious urban legends. It's a story that for decades has been this strange mix of fear, folklore, and a very, very peculiar reality. For years and years, the name Purple Aki was whispered in schoolyards all across the northwest of England. It was one of those names that just blurred the line between a scary story you tell your friends and a terrifying, real-life person. So, was he just a myth, or was he something else entirely? You know, the folklore was wild. It spun these violent tales of a predator who would give his victims some kind of terrible choice. But the real story of the man, Akinwale Arobieke, was somehow even stranger. It involved this obsessive and intimidating fixation that was pretty much unique in British criminal history. Okay, let's dive right in. Who exactly was the man at the center of this decades-long saga? And how did one person become so infamous that his very name became a warning to kids? So he was born back in 1961, and as he grew up, Arobieke became this seriously intimidating figure. I mean, he was 6'5" and a massive bodybuilder, so his presence alone was unnerving. But it was his actions, this strange, relentless obsession with the muscles of young men, that created this ripple of fear and, let's be honest, fascination across the entire region. It got to the point where he wasn't just a person anymore. He became a cultural phenomenon. His name, which, by the way, was a racist nickname he hated, it became a tool to scare people, even people who weren't totally sure if he was real. He literally became a modern-day bogeyman. All right, so now let's unpack how this legend went from a myth whispered in the schoolyard to a documented pattern of harassment that would land him in court again and again. When the police started investigating, they found this chillingly consistent method. It wasn't random at all. It was like a ritual. He'd approach, he'd ask, and then he'd demand. And this pattern, repeated over years with dozens and dozens of young men, left his victims feeling scared, confused, and just completely helpless. And the legal system's view on all this? It was made crystal clear. Back in 2003, after he pleaded guilty to 15 counts of harassment, Judge Slinger really summed it all up. He called him a danger to young men, whose behavior was both strange and obsessive, and then sentenced him to 6 years in prison. But the story had taken a really tragic turn long before that. Years earlier, back in 1986, an incident happened that took Arobieke from being a local menace to a figure tragically linked with death. The relentless pursuit of this one teenager, Gary Kelly, ended in an absolutely horrific tragedy. The kid was just so desperate to escape the man who had been stalking him that he made a fatal decision. And this one event, right here, cemented Arobieke's fearsome reputation in the community for decades. But what happened next, the legal aftermath of this tragedy? It's just astonishing. Arobieke was actually convicted of manslaughter for Gary Kelly's death, but in a shocking reversal, that verdict was completely overturned on appeal. The court basically decided that just standing on a train platform and looking at someone, no matter how intimidating you are, wasn't technically a crime. So legally, he was cleared. He was even awarded compensation, with the court pointing to alleged racial overtones in the original case. But morally, the public was, and still is, completely divided. So, with the manslaughter charge gone and his pattern of harassment just continuing after he got out of prison for other things, the authorities needed a new, more creative way to stop his relentless behavior. And their answer was this highly unusual legal tool, a Sexual Offenses Prevention Order, or SOPO. Now, this was controversial right from the start because these orders are usually for people who've actually been convicted of sexual crimes. I mean, just look at this order. It's bizarrely specific. It was like a legal cage, custom-built just for him, banning the very actions that made him notorious. The fact that it was a Sexual Offenses Prevention Order without a single sexual conviction, well, that made it a landmark and a really hotly debated legal strategy. So did it stop him? Nope. He repeatedly broke the order, which led to more and more prison time. And yet, through it all, he consistently claimed he was the one being unfairly targeted by the police, that it was his reputation, not his actions, that was being prosecuted. And then, after a whole decade, a court kind of agreed with him. A judge ruled that since the more recent complaints didn't really suggest a sexual motive and didn't cause any physical or psychological harm, this super strict order was just excessive. So after 10 years, the infamous muscle-touching ban was gone. And so his story just solidified into this incredibly complex tangle of documented harassment, these groundbreaking legal battles, and his own constant claims of persecution. It leaves behind a legacy that is anything but simple. And just when you think the story can't get any weirder, it does. In a final baffling twist, the man who was prosecuted so many times turned the tables and successfully sued the police. He claimed 2 officers had a personal campaign against him, and he won a big settlement just a few years ago, adding yet another complicated layer to his public image. And then, in August of 2025, the life of one of Britain's most notorious and mythologized figures came to a quiet, pretty unremarkable end. The bogeyman of the Northwest was just gone. So, after all that, what are we left with? It's the central question of his legacy. Was he a dangerous predator whose strange obsessions terrorized a whole generation? Was he a misunderstood man, hounded by a system that had no idea how to handle him? Or was he simply a real-life bogeyman, a figure whose story will keep being told in whispers, forever blurred somewhere between fact and fear?